Australian readers have clasped the novel, the colonial import, to their hearts. A local tradition of novel writing, personal, increasingly memoiristic in tone, has taken shape. Yet, I have a persisting sense that the novel sits uneasily in the Australian context, in the Australian landscape. And here is my next theme. My impression is that the Australian bush has not been successfully transformed into a Western space fit for established models of writing. It is not a landscape that offers us easy grace or immediate redemption. It does not have the flavour of settled European or New World landscapes against which epics of social progress and personal discovery can be straightforwardly played out. There is always something further in the landscape. It is more a place for tales, for deep hidden meanings and symbol-laden fragments. And all this is connected to religion and the religious centre of gravity of this continent. How have Australian writers tried to come to terms with this new world we have taken for our own? Early Westerners exploring through the colony cast their narratives naturally enough in terms of quests for resources, for hidden goals, for salvation and meaning in their displacements as well. The growth of cities bred a new culture reflecting the social and artistic patterns of the mother country, but fast developing individual accents. And that helter-skelter transformation continues to this day, edged always by the anxiety of influences. Australian writing has found a voice and tone and even a field of subjects at breakneck speed. It is only in the past decade, for instance, that the theme of Aboriginality has entered into the literature with such dominating force. But the timing in history of this creation, this birth of a fresh Western society, has had consequences. For one thing, when the Americas took their rise from Hispanic Catholicism and in the present United States from North European Christian communities, Australia's religious identity was always more tenuous. The national story here has not been written with quite so naive and persuasive a Christian pen. Its DNA was shaped too late for that. The spiritual carrier wave of modern multicultural Australia weighted as it is towards the metropolis, and the outlying edge cities may well remain faintly Christian, smeared out between various denominations, both established and newfangled. But the overriding social flavour is definingly secular. There is no intense, unifying religious ideology. And if I can put it this way, the landscape has not been successfully evangelized and claimed, made safe for ordered stories. It is not at the fundamental level within the novelistic realm. If you consult the map, you will find relatively few Christian place names. Those that have the sound of sanctity tend to be the beneficiaries of an indirect christening. Thus the old mining town of St. Arnaud nearby, on the southern fringe of the Mallee, takes its name from a French hero of the Crimean War. The United States, by comparison, is studded with Sacramentos and Corpus Christis and Bethlehems. In nomenclature, it mimics much more closely the religious and emotional topography of Europe. The Australian bush remains inviolate. It colours everything, especially our narratives. To southern listeners or readers, this obsessive focus on the land and its effects on us may seem a touch unreal. Is landscape so important for literature? Does land shape art? Perhaps these ideas may sound suspiciously like stray thoughts gathered in a small tropical city encroached on by mangroves and oppressive screw palms and savannas with fringing red mesa systems and desert sand dunes stretching towards an oblivion of emptiness beyond. But even in the gleaming southern capitals, the landscape awaits. In Sydney, it is there, rising like a green tier beyond the western suburbs. It is there in Melbourne, in the form of bushfire plumes and stray horizon peaks and surrounding river valleys full of tall, ragged eucalypts. Its look and heat and rhythms feed into the human domain. They help build up our world and our words. Just as the novel's international fortunes over the 20th century have been mixed, so too the form's development in Australia has followed a blurred, complex path. If the Western novel reached its climax with the modern epics that Auerbach examined in his closing chapter and found wanting, the Australian variant was only then just in the first phase of its ascent. In the wake of high modernism and its wildernesses of subjectivity, Proust, Joyce, Musil, comes war, and a blaze spreads across the face of Europe. The novel becomes American, filmic, popular, academic. It adapts to its varied circumstances like a magic cloak. Here, the great mid-century works strive for depth and continental coverage. Xavier Herbert, Patrick White. Always the form's fluency prevails. Its matchless mechanism for penetrating minds and mirroring life's feel and texture seem perfectly judged for the pace of contemporary time. Yet, several changes, both at global and local scale, have been sweeping through the novel's kingdom. It is no longer a grand, omnipotent form with urgent, youthful energy. The avant-garde left it behind long ago. Popular taste has migrated to the screen, to new music and other arts. The mimetic charge of the novelistic narrative as the most immediate and convincing of all artistic vehicles has died. That death was Auerbach's veiled subject. At the same time, the Western novel, which was always a class phenomenon, has bred its own self-selected readership. The novel reading class, progressive, internationalist, possessed of a modicum of leisure, deeply interested in subjective states. This class now has the kind of literature it needs, an intelligent literature that underpins certain crucial assumptions. For modern fiction tends to support a broadly secular worldview. It accepts the tenets of psychology. It assumes people are, even in their inmost essence, knowable. It advances almost always towards resolution. There is an air of progress and forward motion in its account of life. More novels are being written today than ever before, and better written, as writing is now so widely studied, but for a more limited readership. Here, though, in this country, even in our settled, well-subsidized phase of literary expansion, it is hard not to feel that issues of authenticity stalk the novel form, and increasingly that they serve as its subject matter. The novel may have colonized Australia, but it remains a foreign style, forged in another environment, forged, in fact, in the thought world of Europe and brought here just as roses and plane trees were brought from far-off shores. One symptom of this transportation may well be the extraordinary prominence of the landscape as a theme in Australian fiction. Land looms large for authors as diverse as Winton and Flanagan, as Stowe and Murnane. It is as if the land were forcing its way into the novelistic narrative, as a central, shaping presence, as a character. The Australian landscape, whether savanna or desert, mountains or tropics, remains hard to assimilate, to map in Western language. The bush is not soft or seasonal. It is pagan, repetitive, untamed. It is far from a neutral, straightforward setting for stories. It has dictates and rhythms of its own. These ideas were with me when I came back from the Middle East to the tranquil Northern Territory, which I had pictured in my mind's eye in the most intense Elysian colours all through the time I had spent away. And so it seemed quite natural to head out at once on a set of journeys across the country in a bid to reacquaint myself with the landscape, to tune my instincts to its music and its pulse. I had the thought, too, that this might lay the groundwork for some new kind of writing and throw up some kind of bridging structure between the inner and the outer worlds. To that end, I made forays into the Western Desert and the far Kimberley, into Arnhem Land and the deep Pilbara, which has always been for me the most elusive and subtly structured region of the North, with its ranges that run straight for hundreds of kilometers and its purple rock and pale yellow spinifex. And my imaginings, as always, were outstared by what I saw. Campsites by Lake Dora full of mating death adders, pale mauve sunsets from a back veranda in Wyndham beneath the shadow of the Bastion lookout, where I could listen for the hypersaline mosquitoes drifting inwards, borne ever closer by the humid breeze above the tide. And it may well be these months of movement yielded nothing. But in all my exchanges and the time I spent with myself, I half suspect now, as I look back, that I was seeking not just for clues to some connected narrative, but also for the scattered, dispersed fragments of a presence in the landscape. How deep that instinct lurks. When I was a child, I spent long periods in the Swiss Alps, and it was that mountain setting, more than anywhere, that I felt gave some resonance with nature. I would be swept away by the gleam of the snow on the high peaks, by the speed and silent coiling of the clouds. Lightning would strike, thunder would roll through the valleys, and the fear and wonder I felt then was the same fear and joy I could sense inside me half a lifetime later, driving in the wet season through continuous light storms in the Carboyd Range near Turkey Creek. It was the same fear and delight I saw in the eyes of old Pintpi men as they drove their troop carriers on through harsh, burnt sand dune country between red mesa systems towards sites in the Gibson Desert, sites unseen for 20 years. They were singing. There were tears in their eyes, tears of love. Such things came to me during those travels. They stayed with me. And I heard also stories from friends of mine who had been living in the tropics or the center for many years. Often these were members of the 60s generation who had gone out into the Aboriginal domain to dedicate themselves to the struggle for Indigenous rights, and who had made their home there and found there a way of living as well as a cause. And now, these individuals, almost always men or women of the greatest idealism and sophistication, were beginning to reflect on the course of their life, what they had achieved, and where their dreams had failed. Early this year in Darwin, I fell into discussion with one of the most dedicated of them, Glendale Schrader, who had just given up his position at the helm of a group of Indigenous-owned Central Australian companies. And we began talking about his first days in the desert, long ago when he was an advisor at the small community of Pipalyatjara. It lies in the Pitjantjara lands, close to Surveyor General's Corner, on the southern flank of the Tonkinson Range, in a stretch of desert country unparalleled for its grandeur and its romantic appeal. The explorer Ernest Giles called the valley where the Pipalyatjara airstrip now lies the Champ de Mars, and bestowed similarly classicizing names on several other features of the surrounding landscape. While Glendale was living in the community, which was small and peaceful, he made it his habit to take long hikes alone through the spinifex, journeys that might last all day. one occasion he decided to climb the high peak that rose nearby and spend the night on its summit and watch the sun come up. It was complete silence then in the bush, he said, leaning nearer to me. Much quieter than today, no vehicles to speak of, no lights, many fewer camels about. I remember that night vividly, and even the memory makes me melt into oblivion. I saw the dawn's gleam beginning hours before it came, pure, shining light. And when the sun was over the horizon in the east, all the desert was lit up and glowing. The shadows of the trees and grasses were stretching out towards me, and to the west, beyond the range, everything was pitch black. Everything. The stars were still bright in the black sky. Then, slowly, the light began to spread across the land. Things took shape, and it was hard not to think of the sun bringing form to earth, bringing that world to life. I listened to him. He spoke with the urgency of a man recounting a pivotal event. There he was, poised between worlds. There he was, looking back on himself, as we both were, trying to find form in life and pattern. And I felt I was on the edge of things that were inexpressible. They hovered close by. I thought how we import patterns into our subjects, how beauty, form and order come, how we find salvation in fragments, structure in nothing, in sand and silence, what has been ground down almost to essence and then been remade. At times it seems to me that something very like this was the fate of the West and its belief world during the course of the dark century just past, which hangs behind us like a receding, devastating thundercloud, and which we still strive to put out of our thoughts with varying degrees of success. This was the background to Auerbach's mimesis. His study of order and pattern in narrative was composed even as the civilization that nurtured him was being torn apart. From his redoubt in Istanbul on the fringes of a Europe in flames, he could not tell how the story would end. It was natural for him to see the world in fragments, pulverized, and to dream that it might be recast and its traditions gathered up again. There was at least a scintilla of light and hope on that far frontier. And though Auerbach was largely deprived of the research material he required for his vast endeavor, he found crucial books stored up in remote corners. As he recounts in a footnote to his appendix, he came upon a dusty set of the patristic texts in an attic-level library room of the Dominicans' monastery of San Pietro di Galazza. The library was private, but the apostolic delegate was kind enough to grant Auerbach the use of it. That delegate, Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, went on to become papal nuncio in Paris, a cardinal, and eventually a pope, and as John XXIII presided over the liberalizing Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965. Under such circumstances, exiled, almost starved of substance, Auerbach wrote his Anatomy of Literary Form, only too well aware that had he been able to sink himself in the relevant sources, he would not have had the sweep of view or clarity of mind to push through and complete his work. And so, from the pale scatter of volumes he could track down, the dust of the ages, he built his memorial and set the capstone on it with these words: "I hope that my study will reach its readers, both my friends of former years, if they are still alive, as well as all the others for whom it was intended, and may it contribute to bringing together again those whose love for our Western history has serenely persevered." Auerbach, of course, despite his impeccably Goethean surname, was of a certain religious background. The Old Testament tradition of dust and ash with which we began, and so he could not linger during the era of National Socialism at the university post he held in Marburg, home of the Elisabethkirche, the loveliest early Gothic church in all German lands. No, it was the wilderness for him, to wander, to seek form in fragments, to sift the rubble of the world for memories of gold and gilded words, and dream that such words might one day be artificed again. He comes to my thoughts often, with his taxonomies of art and his tales of narrative, in the deserts and the rangelands, when I think of stories and the scale of the continent and how life's force sweeps us up, I consider him. For some weeks after that evening talk with Glendale Schrader, I travelled widely in the northwest, to Wyndham, to Fitzroy Crossing, to Lombardina and to Beagle Bay. And while I was on that journey, I was reading, and I often had the sense the country was imparting its tales and episodes to me. Sad stories, sweet ones. And the books I had taken with me for company, I realized, were all Australian books of a particular redemptive kind. Books written to a loose, appealing structure, with connecting principles that were ragged and elusive rather than clear and precise. I had with me The Red Centre by H. Finlayson, a natural scientist who made collecting trips all through the centre in the 1930s and was able to catch the rhythm of the desert ranges to perfection in his prose. I had the newly published, austerely titled Ochre and Rust by the South Australian Museum's senior curator of anthropology, Philip Jones, a book spun round investigations of a set of collected objects. And I had Healers of Arnhem Land, an account of adventures on Millingimby Island and other coastal communities by the psychiatrist John Court. Each of these books had its fragmented charm. Each communicated its mood and tone as much by its mazy form as by its treatment of its subjects. Philip Jones would convey his airy mental elegance by the unfolding of his words as much as by the rigour of his choice of themes. Court expressed his worldview by the unbroken warmth of his moral sunshine. Finlayson was all self-concealment and disclosure through the patterns of his simile construction and the constant modulations of his thought. And I felt these masters and companions were always present at my side as I was reading or as I drove my way through the Kimberley Ranges into the evening and the night. And so I hold this world of dust before my eyes and in my hands and spread it out before you. I've explored these ideas as so many fragments, not just because they are related across distance or by allusion, or because they refer to each other in reflecting ways and radiate towards each other. I do so because it is the broken quality of the world that I am aiming to describe, and its capacity for a ghost of grace as well. And now is the time, in an image, in a last meander rather than through the final flourish of a connected narrative, to seek to draw these thoughts and intuitions closer together and to bind them to the landscape with its air of waiting, of posing questions. I don't think I'll try to summarize where I got up to, but I will say that once more, now is the time to seek to draw these thoughts and intuitions closer together. For years, I have felt that as long as we are meant to live, books will give us the balm and care for all the pain and perplexity we feel. They are given to us. We are always given at the right time the books we need. By chance, around the time that I was making those forays westwards, I also made a trip to Townsville and up into its sparse, distinctive hinterland. And while there, I bought a copy of one of the strangest, most majestic volumes ever produced in Australia. I say volume with some hesitation. Is Angkor to Zilmanton really a book, rather than a piece of art or incunabulum of some kind? It is large and almost unreadably floppy. It is a thick paperback, printed on shiny paper, much wider than it is tall. It was written by Colin Hooper, a philosophically inclined amateur historian with a strong enthusiasm for deserted mining towns. And A to Z, as it is inevitably known by its aficionados, builds into an essay-glutted gazetteer of 520 such places in the North Queensland Gulf Country and Cape York. The book's components form a balance. The photography, the maps and anecdotes distill whole sagas and traditions. I had a copy years ago and followed its lead down many scrubby bush tracks, up creek lines in search of old deserted camps. But it parted company with me somewhere along the way, and all I was left with was my recollection of the author's preface, in which Hooper describes his journeys with a dog and battered Land Rover as companions. The book itself, he advised, is the real journey, completed only when it leads one back to oneself. I fell to reading the new edition, which had been expanded vastly by a further decade of Hooperesque research, and how to resist the story of Williams the Rager and his dangerously pretty wife, or the story of the indigestible meal, or the day the devil laughed. But my eye was drawn eventually to the chapter on Argentine, formerly Thermopylae and Silver City, an exceedingly poor field as it transpired, but not without its myths and legends. And I would surely have found it congenial in its glory days in the 1880s, since most of the miners were destitute and in debt, so much so that on their straggle back to the coast they felt obliged to avoid the surrounding bush hotels, to open up a new road between the mountains into a region that soon became known as Insolvency Valley. One tale stood out. This was the story of a drunk miner who at the shanty filled his billy with bar wastage and staggered out into the night to become hopelessly lost. A search was conducted over the following days, and the missing man was found at last, now quite sober, clutching his billy, which was filled with gold nuggets he had come upon while drunk. But sadly, he had no recollection of where he had uncovered them, or how. And he was wandering the bush, disoriented, much in fact as I picture us all in the drift of life, seeking what he had at once found and lost.